Okay, so part of this new thinking was a move to return to the type of education that occurred in ancient Greece. So while it is a new type of thinking, it is reverting back to an old way, if that makes any sense. But it's new enough at this time that they called it a rebirth. So in ancient Greece, they taught rhetoric, they taught grammar, poetry, history, and Latin. And these subjects become known during the Renaissance as the humanities. And humanists emphasize individual accomplishment. So whereas before they had kind of talked about accomplishment in the means of a community or a church, now humanists are emphasizing the accomplishments of the individual. So they believe that the potential of the human mind was limitless. So as long as you have the tools available to you to learn these things, then your potential to learn and discover was potentially limitless. So in the 1500s, the church was no longer a source of stability and peace, and we'll talk about why that is in our lecture tomorrow. But basically it meant that they started to have a worldly instead of a spiritual focus. So if they couldn't rely on the church anymore, if they couldn't figure out what they needed to know from the church, they were going to figure it out a different way. And this is how this secular thinking, this worldly thinking came about. So humanists argued that individual achievement in education could be expressed if people used their talents in service of their cities. And notice we say cities instead of church. So whereas we said on our test, most of you, when I asked you how much religion played a part on a scale of 1 to 10 in the Middle Ages, most of you said either 7, 8, 9, or a 10, or somewhere in between. And that just goes to show how important religion was to the people of the Middle Ages. Well, now that we've moved past that, people are taking less of what the church says as the law. So this humanist argument, these secular writers, they came up with the idea that the ideal Renaissance man should be the universal man who was accomplished in the classics but also a man of action. So when we say classics, we of course mean the Greek classics, but could also jump into action if need be. So one of these humanist writers, Baldassare Castiglione, wrote The Courtier, and this book described the perfect gentleman, how they should act, and what they should do. And this is the idea of the universal man. So universal man, or the perfect gentleman, or gentlewoman, says that they should speak of serious subjects as well as amusing ones. So you should be able to discuss law and finances and tell a joke in the same sentence. You should have a knowledge of Latin and Greek. Latin because it's the old language, it's what the church is spoken in, but also Greek because of the Greek scholars and because that's what the original manuscripts were written in. You should be well acquainted with poetry and history, so the kind of more classical stuff plus the stark facts. What happened? When did it happen? And you should also be able to write prose as well as poetry. So prose is any written work that is not poetry. So basically you should be able to write everything. So this is the perfect gentleman. This is what Castiglione believed the universal man was. Alright, the next writer that we'll talk about is Niccolo Machiavelli. It's one of my favorite names to say in history. Just go ahead and say it right now if you want to. Just get it off your chest. Alright, great. So, he was a politician whose experience with extremely violent politics, it influenced his opinions on how leaders and government should rule. So, his advice, Machiavelli's advice, seemed to encourage the harsh treatment of both your own citizens and rival nations. He said that we should separate morals from politics, So power and ruthlessness are more useful than idealism to a ruler. So this is kind of that the end justifies the means kind of thinking. And if you don't know what that means, it's that it doesn't really matter how you got somewhere as long as you got there. So you could have killed 1,000 people along the way, but it doesn't really matter because you got what you wanted in the end. And that's kind of Niccolo Machiavelli's thought process. So his idea that the state is an entity in and of itself and is separate from the ruler became the foundation for later political philosophy. So think about how in our nation, how the nation is seen as a separate entity from from our president, and the president is just an office in that state. So if you're a little bit confused on that, come and talk to me about it, but that should be pretty clear. This is just a little side note. If you've seen in The Princess Diaries 2, Nicholas in The Princess Diaries, the guy that Mia ends up with, he is actually named after Niccolo Machiavelli, as his uncle says in the end. And if you've ever seen the movie, you know that his uncle is kind of an awful man, always conspiring, always scheming, and that's kind of the man that Niccolo Machiavelli thought that all rulers should be. So there's just a little connection there if you need it. Alright, so science of the Renaissance. So most of the sciences studied during the Renaissance were human sciences, so like history and geography. But natural sciences were studied too. So when we say human sciences, we mean history, geography, all that sort of stuff, but natural sciences like biology and chemistry and astronomy and stuff like that too. So Nicholas Copernicus, suggested that the sun is the center of the universe and it's orbited by planets and stars. So of course he was laughed at, but we actually know that to be true now. Mind blown, right? That was Nicholas Copernicus, and then Galileo Galilei wrote that the Earth orbited the sun, and because of that, he was placed under house arrest by church officials for expressing his views. So, like the Inquisitions that happened because of heresy, Galileo Galilei was also put under an inquisition because of his ideas on the planets and how they rotated around the sun. So a lot of times the views of scientists directly challenged what the church taught, and the church did not take well to that. There's actually a book called, it's a play. It's by Bertolt Brecht, and it's Galileo, and it goes through his discoveries, his inventions. It talks about how he is inquisitioned and the effects of that inquisition. And it's a pretty good book. It's a play, actually. It's a pretty good play. It's not very long, but if you're feeling more inquisitive about Galileo, you should definitely check it out. Alright, so more than science, more than humanism, any of that, the arts reflected the new humanist spirit that took place during the Renaissance. So while medieval artists had depicted religious themes, Renaissance artists depicted the things they saw in nature. And another difference between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in the arts is that there were actual patrons of the arts in the Renaissance. So think about how starving artists these days in our time, they are always trying to get their work out there. They're trying to have it bought. They're trying to be contracted with someone to make art. That's kind of how it started to be in the Renaissance. So in the Middle Ages, artists usually worked for the church, and it was done anonymously. So nobody cared who you were, just as long as you made pretty pictures in the church. Well, during the Renaissance, artists worked for whomever offered them the highest price. So this could be wealthy people, this could be the government, or it could still be the church. And people displayed their wealth through the purchase of art. So artists got a lot more, their names were more well known in this time. So if you were thinking about having some artwork commissioned for your castle, you could talk to some other people, talk to some other wealthy people, say, "Ooh, I like that picture in your castle. Who made that?" And they would tell you who, and you would seek that person out. Or a lot of times names would just get around about who was the best artist, who had the most, who did the best work. And these artists had a new style, so they wanted to paint the world, the natural world, as realistically as possible, and they used perspective to achieve this. So perspective is basically making things on a flat surface look three-dimensional. So you know how people use shadowing, or they use some sort of effect to make things kind of pop off the page at you instead of looking flat like a 3-year-old did it? That's what perspective is. So that use of shadow, that use of perspective is what it is to achieve that three-dimensional look. And the subject matter changed as well. So they had a real reverence of Greek culture. They were inspired by Greek, the pictures of Greek gods and that sort of thing when they were doing their own, art.